I'm Dr. Dennis Cardone. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Guillaume Lomas. And this is the Sports Medicine Orthopedic Show. Our phone number to join in conversation, any questions, 877-698-3627, 877-NYU-DOCS. And this is Concussion Awareness Week, we'll call it. But actually, Concussion Awareness Day was on September 17th. We're so close. But we're going to be talking concussion. Joining us is Jillian Lessing and Anthony Jones. Jillian, a recent college graduate. She has sustained 4 concussions, including 2 in 2020, one while snowboarding, the other during a hard landing from kiteboarding. She's been undergoing treatment for lingering concussion symptoms such as headache, nausea, dizziness here at the NYU Langone Concussion Center. So it'd be great to get a patient perspective, Jillian Lessing. And also joining us, athletic trainer Anthony Jones. And Anthony, athletic trainer, certified strength and conditioning specialist here at NYU Langone Health, where he also works with athletes who have sustained concussions to help them return to play. Jillian, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us. Morning. Let's start with Jillian. Jillian, one, sorry to hear about your struggles with concussion, and 4 certainly too many. But maybe talk to us just a little bit about concussion number 1 and now versus concussion number 4, and what's been lingering, and with regard to maybe not a full recovery.
Yeah, so concussion number 1 kind of happened in a quite embarrassing way. It was a non-contact sport. I was playing tennis and actually collided with my doubles partner. It was our first time on the court together. And so obviously our communication was just lacking. And we hit, and my concussion came from whiplash. And those symptoms, I remember them to be very different. It happened about 8 years ago at this point. But there was a lot of visual distortion, a lot of headaches, and a lot of I was having very difficulty concentrating during school. And then sounds and noise and lights triggered a lot of different symptoms. And so those are the majority of the symptoms back in 9th grade when that accident happened. And then the symptoms from my most recent concussion are very different because now it's a lot of nausea and dizziness. And headaches are still there, but the nausea and the dizziness are quite constant. So that was a very different experience for me to be dealing with, I guess.
So let's talk about this 4th concussion. How long has it been? When was it?
It was in January 2020. As you mentioned, I was snowboarding. I was up at school in Vermont, and somebody collided with me from behind. And so I don't really remember much except hearing the person coming and then my head hurting. And I was on the ground. I wasn't unconscious, but the only thing I remember is something's wrong and my head is hurting a lot.
Okay, so it's about a year and a half, we'll call it 18 months, year and a half. And so lingering still, this feeling of dizziness, vision, or what are your symptoms now?
My symptoms on the regular day-to-day are dizziness, nausea, headache. They kind of come and go throughout the day. Once the dizziness and nausea are there, they kind of linger for the rest of the day. And as the headache gets worse, those symptoms get worse as well. And then in terms of working and schoolwork, I should mention I'm also just a recent grad, but I noticed that during activities I'm trying to concentrate a lot is I cannot focus on, if I have a train of thought, sometimes that kind of disappears. I have no clue what I was writing, and I'll just sit there for a couple of minutes trying to get that back, but it's often gone once it's gone. And so it's just a lot of trouble kind of forming thoughts and then writing them onto the page and making sure that, they make sense and they're cohesive together. Coherent.
Yeah. So let me, it unfortunate that you're still struggling with these symptoms, and I think for our listeners, right, there is a very small percent, because it is a very small percent of people who sustain concussion who have prolonged symptoms like yourself. And, certainly unfortunate, Jillian, that you're having these symptoms. And it's difficult for us to predict anyone who's going to, have these prolonged symptoms. There have been some studies and some recent ones that have looked at what symptoms are possible predictors of prolonged recovery. So certainly not even a year and a half, but when we say prolonged recovery for weeks or maybe months, and something like dizziness or vision changes seems to be at the top of the list for some of these prolonged symptoms. And we'll bring Anthony into the conversation in a bit, but tell us maybe a little bit about the treatment that you've been receiving.
Yeah, so I started off, when I got the concussion from the snowboarding, I was kind of in denial. My doctor, at that point, I was just at school, but he's like, I think you should do vestibular therapy. I'm like, no, like, that's too much. I don't need it. At some point, he was just like, okay, I think you really need to go. And so I started doing vestibular therapy, and I did that for a couple months. And then once kind of the pandemic really came into swing here on Long Island in New York, I kind of stopped doing that just because I wasn't comfortable going into the office anymore. But then once summer came about, and then I got my other concussion from kiteboarding, I went back to vestibular therapy, and I've been doing that for months. And that kind of stopped once I went back to school because there's so many restrictions in terms of just being on campus, and I was very lucky to be there, but I couldn't leave. And so I did mostly vestibular therapy, but I continued my exercises by myself because I got a whole bunch of them from my vestibular therapist. And mostly just kind of is with me going to my doctors every so often and just kind of a checkup, and having the telehealth is incredibly useful when you're stuck on campus up in school in Vermont and you need to talk to your doctors here in New York. So it was mostly just vestibular therapy by myself, and then kind of check-ins here and there with the doctors.
We're talking with Jillian Lessing, and we will be talking with Anthony Jones, and we're talking about concussion and concussion awareness. So if you have any questions or tell us about your experience with concussion, give us a call, 877-698-3627, 877-NYU Docs. You know what, Anthony? So Anthony, athletic trainer. So, listen, we know for a good sports medicine program, there's no one more important than an athletic trainer. You are the one on the field, on site. Tell us, so Jillian is obviously a little bit atypical to have such prolonged symptoms. Tell us about what you see typically in your athletes who sustain concussion in terms of maybe some initial symptoms, treatment provided, and how long it takes, more typical, to get back on the field.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me, Dr. Perdone, and thank you, Jillian, for sharing your story. It's very important that we kind of have these interesting experiences be told so people understand how important it is to continue to pay attention to concussions. So, obviously, in my setting, I currently right now work primarily with high school students. So whenever I start off in a position covering as an athletic trainer, very important to just, first of all, foster a culture of reporting athletic concussions and injuries. Because typically in athletes, you have this idea of trying to hide away concussions, and in most cases, we try to have athletes share these experiences because it's very important to diagnose concussions early on so we can isolate some of those signs and symptoms. So, as you said, some of the signs and symptoms that I usually see with individuals with the same concussions, they can go from being very minor to being very severe. But physically, you'll have individuals that will complain of headaches or nausea or dizziness in the moment. Cognitively, you may have an individual on the sideline who may be slow to process your instructions or answer any questions or have difficulty concentrating or remembering. And then you may notice some kind of emotional mood changes as well, which can be common as this is a condition that has very evolving symptoms.
You know what, Anthony? What do you think about? I'm gonna interrupt. So, for most of the athletes you see, do they recognize? Do you think? Do they say, do they recognize the symptoms of concussion, or it's kind of, hey, you know what? I took a hit and I'm feeling this, and maybe they won't even come over on the sideline to talk to you about it.
I think it varies based on kind of how the organization was established. So if you have a good education in place of educating the athletes and the coaches of what the signs and symptoms of a concussion are, I've seen that it's typically you have a better chance of an athlete coming to the sideline and being able to properly express that they're experiencing these symptoms and I think they may have a concussion. Versus that education isn't there, they may, you have this good culture, which is more typical in football, where they say, I just got my bell rung, and they're not really sharing this information. So I think the educational aspect of that is very important because that increases your likelihood of having these athletes being able to relay these symptoms if they're aware of what are some signs and symptoms and possible red flags, which is why it's very important to have that, as you kind of alluded to, having somebody on the sideline who's versed in being able to spot the signs and symptoms of a concussion, regardless of the level of education. It's good to have that secondary individual there to point out and spot these instances so they can pull that athlete to the side and perform a full evaluation.
I want to just go back to Jillian for a second, because, especially in a case where, like yours, where unfortunately there's been multiple instances, I think I'm curious, and our audience would be curious to know how you approach sports now. Is there an element of apprehension? Obviously, the last thing you want is to have another concussion, and we do talk about something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes kind of overlaying all of this, because athletes that have had concussions really want to avoid having another one. So how do you approach sports, now, having gone through this a few times now, or do you feel like you hold something back, or are a little bit more cautious?
Yeah, so right now, exercise is something that kind of sets off my symptoms. And so if I'm doing like a high intensity workout, I start to get really nauseous really quickly. And so right now I'm kind of just limited to shorter runs, or just a couple of miles, and then like a short workout like afterwards. But other than that, I really can't go much further. In terms of sports, I have been kiteboarding, but I'm literally doing the bare minimum. Any sort of, like if I'm just diving into the water, even like today, I feel that in my head. I don't know if it's just like mental or something, but I can feel like the impact, and it freaks me out definitely. And so I am kind of wearing this huge like bubble wrap thing around my head at all times now. So I kind of really don't let myself do the things that like wakeboarding or kiteboarding. I don't let them do the same either at all, or to the same intensity that I was doing before. I really just, it freaks me out. The concussion is obviously still ongoing, or the symptoms are still ongoing, and the way that it kind of changed me for this past year and a half is definitely enough for me to deter me from doing kind of higher intensity things. So right now I'm kind of just doing lower intensity exercises just to stay in shape, but otherwise I haven't returned to full sports yet.
Yeah, no, and we're sorry to hear that. Anthony, from your perspective, say someone is finally kind of out of the darkest place, right, of post-concussion recovery. And so let's assume Jillian, hopefully soon, not having symptoms, not feeling nauseous, feeling like herself. What has been your experience in how these athletes approach sports? Obviously, she's got youth on her side, and that's a very powerful tool for just resilience and kind of getting back on the horse. But what strategies do you usually employ to maybe take some of the fear away once the symptoms are resolved and they're cleared to resume normal activities?
I think what usually helps the athlete most, and it's definitely already built into the concussion management plan, is that like progressive return to play protocol, where they're not jumping back into activity, full go from the beginning. So starting off that progression and getting the athlete more comfortable with the different aspects of whatever that sport is. Slowly over time, typically, gets their feet wet and has them understand that, okay, I ran a little bit more today and I didn't feel symptoms. Okay, that's a small win. Because you want to give these athletes as much victories as you can, for lack of a better term, and showing them that they have conquered a new goal. Okay, I've done this sport-specific activity. Okay, I was able to practice with the team and my symptoms are very minimal. I've been able to, improve my time a little bit and my symptoms were minimal. And then there's always the personal aspect of it and being able to relay and connect with your athletes on a daily basis and really talk to them about things other than sports, because it's an all-encompassing, as Jillian kind of related experiences. It goes past sports. It affects your daily life. It affects your mood. It affects the way you may be interpreting things in your environment. So you want to have these personal connections with your athletes and kind of talk to them about stuff outside of athletics to kind of get a holistic approach of getting them back to not just being an athlete, but being back to a normal person in their eyes, whatever that is. So.
Certainly a very important part of this has been, and from a therapeutic perspective and also from that mental psychological perspective, is that we know now, if after only 2 to 3 days post-concussion, to already start this, what we call this sub-threshold exercise program, where they're where that athlete individual is exercising at a level that's not causing them to have any symptoms. And I think psychologically it's a benefit, of course, to get back to doing activity early on, and probably helps, just like you're saying, Anthony, in that gradual return and recovery. And we also have evidence that shows that it helps decrease the time out of sport and improve recovery time from a concussion. So really, really good and important points. And just for our listeners, we are talking concussion, and joining us is Jillian Lessing. And Jillian, a recent college graduate who has sustained 4 concussions and is currently undergoing treatment for lingering symptoms, including headache, nausea, and dizziness. And Anthony Jones, an athletic trainer, certified strength and conditioning specialist here at NYU Langone Health. And we're taking all your phone calls, any questions, maybe tell us about your experience with concussion, 877-698-3627. 877 NYU Docs. Anthony, how about on the anything? What would you signs of an athlete maybe struggling to get back? One, from recovery from concussion, and maybe just returning to sport, not at 100%. Things that you look for.
Things I look for are obviously visual signs, like athletes not looking quite like themselves or what you remember them as an athlete. You look for kind of like plateaus and improvement. As you check in with your athletes daily as an athletic trainer, if you're gotten to a point where you're getting constant improvement, but then you reach a section or a point in time where that improvement tends to stall, it usually warrants trying to reevaluation of the plan that's going forward, and probably connecting with other healthcare individuals, because concussion management is a multidisciplinary, plan. So you need to, rely on an athletic trainer. I rely on, other healthcare professionals to assist me in any way that, is possible in terms of development of proper plans for the athlete, whether it's you need additional vision, rehab, or additional vestibular care that can't be provided while I'm on the sideline managing, multiple teams in the case of a high school program. So, and then kind of going back to the benefit of being an athletic trainer is that I'm there on a daily basis, very in close contact. So athletes tend to be a little bit more personal than they would be with their primary care physician that they may only see a couple of times a week. So they tend to relay extra information that can be helpful in determining if there's additional need or additional changes that need to take place in that athlete's plan.
One question I have for both of you guys is, just because this has been in the news a lot more, so CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, right? And Jillian, maybe just to start with you, is this something that you've read about? And I'm just curious, having had some concussions, is this something that you think about it? I'm just curious about how the information has filtered down to the real world. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I actually haven't heard of it. I think
Good.
For myself, I try not to, barrel down too far into medicine on Google, just because I don't want to freak myself out. So, I actually haven't heard of it even.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, and I think that's, and I say good, not, obviously knowing more is always better, but there has been a certain level of hysteria connected to it, and CTE, even now, I was just at the Association of Ringside Physicians annual conference, and we had Bob Cantu, who, one of the foremost experts on concussion, talk to us about potentially diagnosing CTE in the living, and it's just not there. And so I think it's important that we maintain just a very kind of rational approach to this. And Anthony, maybe the last minute or so, what is this something that comes up with your athletes with concussion?
Not particularly. Even in instances when I work with football, it's not a really discussion that I hear at a lower level, because they're more interested in competing and being successful. So I feel like in most cases the athletes tend to not dwell on that stuff as much. From my perspective, I'm more so concerned about making sure these athletes are, when they do sustain a concussion, which is more likely, depending on the sport, like football or wrestling or cheerleading in some cases, that they don't get back to activity too quickly, which can put them at risk of secondary impact syndrome, which is, a traumatic brain injury that can occur if you sustain a secondary concussion too close in proximity to your first one without proper recovery. So
and in terms of CTE, as we know, probably there's a lot of unknowns, and certainly it seems that maybe it's more sub-threshold hits that over a period of time. So prevention is really key.
Yeah,
right?
and I only bring it up because even, I don't know if you remember the Ben Askren, Jake Paul fight. Jake Paul saying he had it, then had to retract it. So
you're listening to the Sports Medicine Orthopedic Show. Jillian, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us. Great segment on concussion. Really appreciate your time. Thank you. Sports Medicine Orthopedic Show, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back.